Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to today's event on the social impact of open data. Today's event is being recorded and webcast, so also welcome to all of you who are joining us online. If you'd like to participate and you're not in the room, you can do so via Twitter using the hashtag Data Innovation. If you're in the room, we'll have a Q&A period as well, or you can use Twitter if you'd like. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm the director of the Center for Data Innovation. I'm also senior analyst here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. For those of you that don't know the Center for Data Innovation, we're a new think tank started up about a year ago that's focusing exclusively on how public policy can be used to maximize the benefits of data-driven innovation. And our goal is really to close the gap between the potential of data and where we are today. Today's event is being co-sponsored by both the Center and the Sunlight Foundation, so I want to thank you guys for working with us on this. So just to set the stage, open data, or data that's made widely available for reuse without restrictions, has received a lot of attention lately, especially for the economic benefit. And the economic impact of open data is really undeniable. Open data is not only helping create new businesses and new jobs, but it's leading to new efficiencies in basically any industry that you look at. Higher productivity for companies and lower costs for consumers. There's a well-cited McKinsey report that talks about open data contributing about $3 trillion in global economic value across 7 sectors, forced contributions in areas like healthcare, energy, and finance. But the purpose of today's event is really to shine some light on how open data is having a tremendous impact on non-economic areas as well. And so, this is everything from, having a more transparent and responsive government, which is really what a lot of the original open data movement was about, to helping people just make better decisions in lots of different areas of their life, from questions like what hospital should I go to, what doctor should I see for the best care, what school should I study at, what major should I have in college, or what's the best way to commute to work. But I think the key here is if we really want to understand why open data has been so successful, we want to look at a few critical factors that have led to its success. The first one is data quality. And this is the availability of comprehensive, high-resolution, very granular, and timely data sets. We also have what I like to call data explorability, or the freedom to both discover new data sets and discover new insights into data sets. So you can analyze it, you can look at these relationships without restriction. And finally, data portability, or the ability to use and combine data sets in ways that were never considered before, or probably weren't even considered at the point of collection. So for me, one of the important questions is really how do we create some of the kind of fundamental necessary conditions that allow open data innovation to be so successful. How do we create these conditions in areas where we have closed data? Because if we look at the entire universe of the data that's out there, open data is really this kind of small pocket right now. And it's the pocket where we have tremendous success, but we want to expand that to the whole range of data that's available. And it's just this huge kind of untapped potential. And to help answer this question today, and the reason I'm starting with that premise is we've invited FTC Commissioner Maureen Olhausen to make some opening remarks. If you don't know Commissioner Olhausen, she's probably the leading policymaker in Washington who understands both the regulations, a tool for empowering consumers, and also for fostering innovation. She has a distinguished career in public service, both at the Federal Trade Commission and in the federal court system. She first joined the FTC in 1997 and served in multiple roles, including the Director of Office of Policy and Planning, and then, of course, most recently, she was sworn in as FTC Commissioner in 2012 for a term that's expiring in 2018. So please join me in welcoming Commissioner Olhausen.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for that nice introduction and for inviting me to kick off what I'm certain will be a very insightful discussion of open data and its benefits for society. As society has integrated and adopted increasingly powerful computers and pervasive communications networks, we've created massive amounts of data. And government has been a major participant in this data revolution, both gathering and creating large stores of data about an enormous range of topics. And new techniques and tools have the potential to create great value from both recent and historical government data. And I think that there are several steps that the FTC can take to help facilitate more open government data. But at this point, I should say my remarks are just my own and not necessarily those of the other commissioners. So modern data analysis techniques, sometimes colloquially referred to as big data, are incredibly useful tools. And today, data has greater volume, variety, and velocity. Or, to put it more simply, there's a lot of data, it has a lot of different forms, and it's created rapidly. Tools that can pull useful needles of insight from this data haystack have a great potential to make our lives better. Data alone is not knowledge, however. The promise is that big data techniques will help us extract knowledge from this data, and this knowledge will help us better understand ourselves and the world around us. And obviously, we're already seeing benefits from the use of big data techniques on private sector data. So Amazon and eBay and Netflix and many other online merchants use big data to generate customized consumer recommendations. Other companies use big data to predict commute times by aggregating millions of GPS signals. I use that a lot myself in DC traffic. To identify potential causes of disease and to detect and prevent credit card fraud. A well-known example is that Kaiser Permanente used big data analysis to uncover an increased chance of heart attack or cardiac death among Vioxx users as compared to users of a competing medication. And scientists are using massive data sets and powerful analytic tools to make progress on the most difficult problems in the health sciences as well as the hard sciences. And many new uses are emerging, particularly because consumers are no longer simply data points to be researched. And today's consumers are themselves producers and users of big data, whether posting billions of photos on Facebook or using Bing's flight price predictors to make travel plans, or joining the self-quantification movement by wearing a Fitbit Flex and using an area bathroom scale like I do. I've got my little one on right now. As more of our everyday existence becomes measurable and recordable, the greater potential there is for big data to provide helpful insights. Yet, in our quest for meaning, we should not forget more conventional sources. In particular, the government is, and has long been, a major data producer. Often, when people talk about government and data, they focus on government as a consumer of information and how government should or should not be limited in the data it can collect and use. And we have an entire section of constitutional law dedicated to that topic. But there is another aspect of government data that isn't discussed as much, except perhaps by the people in this room. Government as a producer of data. Federal and state and local governments generate and store massive amounts of data about themselves and about us and really about the world around us. Even before the very first U.S. Census report, government has been producing large and increasing amounts of data. Government produces many types of data. Personal data, such as Social Security earnings, tax information, unemployment filings, and voter registration. Societal data, such as demographics and employment estimates and economic indicators. And impersonal or scientific data, such as about weather and climate conditions and measurements and geolocation data. Now, there's great potential in applying powerful new big data tools to the rich troves of government data. And the private sector could use the wide range of government-produced data to reveal new insights into difficult problems in nearly every area of human endeavor. In fact, you mentioned the McKinsey report. It's the McKinsey and Company report, which has estimated that opening government data to private sector access has the global potential to create more than $3 trillion in additional value annually. We already have many positive examples of how the private sector uses government data. Every weather forecaster builds his or her forecast on the raw data and models provided by the National Weather Service and similar government organizations around the world. And investors pore over government financial and agricultural and economic reports in making decisions. So those of you like me who grew up in the 1980s may recall the climax of the Dan Aykroyd, Eddie Murphy movie Trading Places actually turned on the release of one such report, Department of Agriculture's Orange Crop Report. So I'm definitely revealing my age there. But the FTC's recent data brokers report noted that many data brokers rely on government data, such as city demographics and geographical information, professional licenses, real property and assessors records, court records, and more to market products and to prevent fraud. And these are just a few examples. Overall, in a recent report, the Commerce Department concluded firms that intensively use the statistical agency's data, combine it with other government and private sector data, to create between $24 billion and $221 billion in annual revenues. The upcoming panel will talk about the benefits of open government data, and I'm sure they'll share a whole bunch of other examples. But with my remaining time, I'd like to focus on what the Federal Trade Commission can do to promote useful access to government data. First, to promote access to government data, the FTC should adopt and promote a realistic view of big data. Big data is a useful tool that, like all tools, has both strengths and shortcomings. Data, even big data, isn't knowledge or wisdom. It can be misleading. There can be signal problems where the data set, huge as it may be, does not represent the real world. The City of Boston's Street Bump mobile app is an example. The crowdsourced pothole finding mobile phone app identified more potholes in wealthy areas of the city simply because residents of those neighborhoods had more smartphones. Big data sets can also let us mislead ourselves. As Nate Silver explains in his book, The Signal and the Noise, our instinctual shortcut when we have too much data is to pick out the parts we like and ignore the remainder. Big data is particularly vulnerable to the multiple comparisons problem. Big data tools are very good at discovering statistical correlations between variables in complex data sets. And because there are many variables in the typical big data set, there are many potential relationships for a researcher to test. And if a researcher explores a big data set without a particular question or theory in mind, but simply tries enough comparisons between variables, they'll often find a statistically significant correlation that doesn't reveal anything useful about causation in the real world. By understanding the limits of big data and emphasizing the need for human judgment in the use of such tools, the FTC can help tamp down the hype over big data. The FTC can help create a healthier regulatory atmosphere by critically evaluating the claims of both the pop science promoters of big data as the magic bullet solution and the naysayers who fear massive consumer harm from all-knowing algorithms. A realistic understanding of big data's potential will help the agency to identify and focus on actual harms to consumers if they occur. Second, the FTC can continue to provide guidance on how to protect the privacy of individuals while promoting open data. Obviously, many, perhaps even the majority of government data sets have nothing to do with personally identifiable information. Open access to many scientific and economic data sets, for example, raise no privacy risks. However, opening other useful data sets may raise some privacy concerns. For example, applying big data techniques to government health data or education records could help address the most pressing societal issues we face, but people understandably worry about how such information is used and how it's shared. The FTC can guide other government agencies on how to open access to data while mitigating privacy risks through things like aggregation, de-identification, use-based limitations, and other techniques. Furthermore, the FTC must continue to explore how to resolve the tension between the promise of big data and certain fair information practice principles, such as notice and purpose limitation and data minimization, which strictly applied could hinder big data's promise. Third and finally, the FTC can help promote a government, industry, and consumer culture that embraces open data and innovative data analysis. By taking a humble regulatory approach to the fast-changing data industry, the FTC can help create this culture. Our most successful technological advances, such as the Internet itself, have generated massive consumer welfare and have thrived largely because market participants have enjoyed wide latitude to experiment with new technology-driven business models, allowing the market to determine which models succeed and which fail. Ultimately, our work as an agency should help strengthen competition and allow the market to better provide beneficial outcomes in response to consumer demand, rather than dictate desired outcomes to the market. Similarly, the FTC should focus its enforcement efforts on bad actors actually causing substantial harm, rather than attempt to preempt speculative future harms. By doing so, we can help build support and consumer confidence in emerging technologies while allowing innovation to flourish. The FTC recently recommended that Congress consider requiring data brokers that they give consumers more transparency and control over the information such brokers have about individual consumers. I believe a proper implementation of this recommendation could help consumers embrace the big data movement. Increased government transparency about the data it holds also promises similar benefits. Allowing consumers to easily access the information the government has about them could also promote consumer interest in and their acceptance of open data more generally. And I urge government agencies to explore how they could achieve more transparency about the data that they hold on individuals. To conclude, more open government data promises to fuel insights across the spectrum of human endeavor, including in science and economics and education and sociology. And big data tools will help us find useful insights from the massive data the government produces. By embracing a realistic, informed view of big data's potential, providing guidance on privacy issues raised by open government data in the age of big data tools, and by promoting a culture that embraces open data and innovative data analysis, the FTC can serve an important role in ensuring that citizens benefit from the massive amounts of data produced by the government. And I hope that all of you will see the FTC as an ally in these efforts to expand access to government-produced information, and will reach out to us with any specific suggestions or concerns. So thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A now. Commissioner Olhausen has agreed to stick around for a few minutes, and then we're going to move into the panel discussion. So I'll open up the floor. If you can just say your name and any affiliation, and we'll get started.
Alex Howard from Tech Republic. The FTC itself has a fair bit of data, but I'm not clear about how much it's released. Many people who are proponents of open data hold that releasing data about the companies or industries being regulated can in fact have an impact upon the markets. And if you look at what the CFPB has done in releasing, say, credit card fees or complaints, they've seen an improvement upon the industries being regulated of a couple percent, according to Business Week. Has the FTC considered releasing some of its own regulatory data, and in which case, and if so, which data sets?
So the FTC actually has been a pioneer in this area, and so several years ago we created Consumer Sentinel, where we are a repository of consumer complaint data. We receive it from consumers, we get it from other law enforcement agencies. And that information is shared among law enforcers, but we do use it to produce a report that says what are the types of frauds, what are the types of complaints consumers are experiencing, and we use it for several reasons. One, it helps inform, an industry should care if they're at the top of the list of complaints, but also we use it as a way to target our enforcement towards those areas that have the greatest consumer impact. Now, other certain types of information, we do annual reports on our antitrust, what kinds of filings we've had, what the actions have been, but we can't release sensitive competitive information. We get a lot of that in connection with antitrust analysis. We also get some sensitive personally identifiable information about consumers who've been victims, who might be witnesses, and all of that we have to keep secure. So we try to release what we can in a way that is useful but doesn't create any additional competitive or consumer harms.
With respect to the complaints, you mentioned reports that are released. Those are often released online as PDFs, which are not, as many people know, machine readable. Is the FTC considering taking the data in those reports and releasing them in a way that could be integrated into consumer services?
I can certainly ask when I get back.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Picking up on that point, Owen Amber, I'm retired from the federal government. I chair AIM's Strategy Markup Language Committee. StrataMel is next mill vocabulary and schema for strategic and performance plans and reports. The GIFR Modernization Act requires federal agencies to publish their strategic and their performance plans and reports in machine-readable format. Doesn't say open standard machine readable format, but we all know that would be better. Does FTC plan to publish its, or how does it plan to comply with the GIPRA Modernization Act?
So we certainly comply with GIPRA, and I actually, at different points in my career, was in charge of overseeing the creation and release of our strategic plan. So I have to go back and ask how we would comply with that. But if it's a requirement, I'm sure we'll be complying with making it a machine.
Because again, OMB has put up the performance.gov site, but the data on that site has been copied from PDF and Word and other things and had data quality issues that make it difficult to reuse.
Thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Great. Other questions? Yes. Ed Yu from the FBI. So one of the challenges of data and being submitted into open data sets is the veracity. And you use the Trading Places analogy, and I'll take it one step further. It was false data that made the Duke brothers lose all their holdings. Are we set up in place to determine that, identify that type of activity and for attribution purposes and to either interdict or prevent that type of activity?
So you're talking about false data being introduced into government data sets and data quality issues. And I mean, that's certainly something that we need to consider carefully, right? Because it could have big impacts. I would hope that some of the big data tools where you've got, increased ability to, kind of cross-check to see what's false and, is there something anomalous about this result that as we look, across data sets, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, would help uncover that. But that is a question about, accuracy of government data to begin with. We did talk about that in the data brokers report. This is really for more of a consumer impact. But the idea, so we already have the Fair Credit Reporting Act. All of you may be familiar with that. So if a credit reporting agency has a consumer report about you that has some inaccuracies, you have access to it and you have a right to correct it. But we talked about outside the credit area with the aggregation of data profiles through data brokers. If a consumer is being denied the ability to engage in a transaction, do they get some indication of what data that decision is based on? And can they go back and correct it? Because they may want to go back and correct a government record or something like that has inaccurate information.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Nick Diakopoulos, University of Maryland. So you mentioned the notion of maybe getting data brokers to be more transparent with the data that they're collecting. And also that you were pursuing sort of enforcement of the real issues, what are the actual dangers and risks for consumers. I'm wondering if you could sort of elaborate on that a little bit. What are some of the risks and dangers that you're seeing consumers reporting in terms of how data brokers may be using their data?
So some of the concerns, we've actually brought enforcement actions against some companies that were they were apps and they were collecting information and then packaging it and selling it to people to use for employment screening purposes and rental, whether you rent an apartment to somebody, and the data was not correct. I mean, talk about the problem with data quality. It had incorrect reports that people were child molesters and on a registry when they weren't, and things like that. So we've actually brought some enforcement actions in those areas that these companies do need to adhere to some of these requirements, particularly using data to make important decisions about whether people have access to credit, employment, insurance, things like that. So there's a case called Spokio, Philiquarian, and there was some other one, but I don't remember. But if you those are two that'll get you started. So.
Great. I think we have time for at least one more question yet.
Hi, Colby Hockney with Federal Computer Week. You mentioned increasing transparency and having users know what information the government has on them. Can you elaborate a little bit more on sort of how that would be done?
So obviously that's a challenge, right? Because what we don't want to do is facilitate things like identity theft, which the FTC spends a lot of time trying to reduce. So there would have to be careful controls in place. And it's interesting because that was one of the things we learned about in the data brokers report, is that a lot of the information data brokers collect and the way they're used is actually for fraud mitigation products, which reduce the likelihood that somebody will be able to access data incorrectly, inappropriately, that data about somebody else. So it is a bit of a balancing test where in some ways you need more data to protect access to data. So I think it's something that it's hard to give a uniform answer to, because different types of data can be very different, have very different sensitivity levels. And we have also types of data that have always been publicly available. When you think about records of who, real estate records, who own things, and that's always been open and should continue to be open because it's important, for other reasons. So, so I'm sorry I don't have a uniform answer, but it's one of those that it all depends on the level of data and how it will be used.
Great. Well, I'll take moderator's privilege and ask one last question of you. I just want to go back. You had mentioned Street Bump, and the this was an app in Boston that allowed users to report if there was a pothole. So the problem that you mentioned is that affluent areas might report more than unaffluent areas. So what do you see as the solution to that? Because it seems like you can take at least one of two tracks. One would be to say we need to regulate how that information is being used, or the second is to say we have a data divide issue here, and we need to really work to close that divide. So how do you see the FTC kind of approaching that type of issue?
So I think there's two questions there. One is that we need to be aware of sampling bias and things like that. So the traditional data analysis techniques continue to play. Things involving the digital divide. One of the things that I've seen is that it's been very interesting to me that as we've moved from sort of the accessing the internet and a lot of new services up through the desktop to the handset, actually low-income groups and new immigrants actually access the internet a lot more frequently over their handsets. And so one of the things the FTC has tried to focus on is what is that like for consumers? Are there different kinds of frauds that are occurring? Are they getting the right disclosures? A disclosure that's been designed for like a big screen may not translate very well to your to your handset or an app. Or what kinds of information are being provided through your handset that is like a much richer data set than if you were just sitting in your house, and making sure that consumers have a little more insight into that, and maybe that like things like location data that can be very sensitive, that they get a choice in whether to share that. So I think that's one of the things that we can do, is to make sure that as people transition to using lower cost ways of accessing the internet, that some of those consumer protections go along with them.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking the Commissioner for joining us today. For those of you that came in a little bit late, you're welcome to please come up. There's food in this room. There's also seats up front. There's a few seats here on the left if you'd like to grab a seat. So now we're turning to our panel discussion, where we're going to really dig into a lot of these open data benefits that we've been talking about here. So immediately to my left, I'll go through and introduce our panel. Immediately to my left is Emily Shaw, who's the National Policy Manager at the Semite Foundation, oversees its state and local policy work. Continuing on, Brian Rayburn. Brian is the lead data scientist at SimCat, which is a company that uses open data to help consumers make accurate self-diagnosis. He received his master's degree from Johns Hopkins, where he helped also develop a fetal heart rate monitor for emerging markets. And then at the end is Sandra Moscoso, who runs the World Bank Finance Program. She also works quite a bit on community efforts related to education, active transportation, and open government. So I don't know whose slides we have up first. Why don't we start with Emily?
Oh, what did we say to start?
That's fine. Start with Sandra.
Sure. You can start.
Yeah.
So, just to keep it in. Keep it to the 5 minutes. I'm going to just read from my notes, if that's okay. Yeah? So, hi. Thank you, Daniel. Center for Data Innovation and Silent Foundation for including me in this panel. And thank you, everyone. I'm excited to learn from all of you. While preparing for this event, let me guess.
Alex, can you load this slide?
Thank you. While preparing for this event, I Googled social impact to see how it's defined by the world. So the Center for Social Impact in Australia defines it as the net effect of an activity on a community and the well-being of individuals and families. That sounded pretty good to me. Now, what is the role of open data in affecting social impact? In terms of developing countries, Tim Davies, who is conducting research on behalf of the Worldwide Web Foundation, is exploring emerging impacts of open data. He says that open data has the following potential impacts. It can lead to improved governance, it can support citizens' rights, and it can promote more inclusive development. Now, I can believe this is true. I believe this can be true in developing countries, but I actually believe this is true in all countries. So I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, but I see open data as having the potential to kind of eliminate the way that we think about development, yeah? Whether it's development in DC or development in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. These impacts play out at global, country, community, and individual levels. I'm here to talk about the impacts of open data on education and on international development. So I'm going to talk about education first, and sorry Alex, thank you. I have this slide that has two columns with what I perceive to be the benefits of open data from the government perspective and from the community perspective. But here's a hint, they're the same exact things. They just kind of are shuffled based on where maybe the greater impact would be. And I would venture to say that the same is true, the same can be true for private sector. Yeah? So in theory, community, government, and even the private sector should be able to benefit from open data, as long as all of the above have access to data, as long as there is data literacy among the various data consumers, and as long as these data consumers collaborate. Yeah. On education, my expertise is that of a consumer, as a parent of 2 children in DC schools. I'm not an educator, I'm not an education policy maker, I'm a mom. Maybe I'm more engaged in the school systems than most moms, but my expertise really comes from being a parent. What I want to do is share with you just a few of my favorite examples of how open data has had an impact on education. Yeah? So the first example is one of school choice. School choice by parents, school choice by children, sometimes as they get older. And in cities or in countries or in regions where there is school choice, there's probably a little bit of school choice angst that comes along with it. And I think that is why you see so many school choice apps that are being developed in places where there is data available, whether it's location data about schools, or testing results about schools, or whatever else is being made available. So I've come up with 10 quick examples, and they're from all over the world. So not just Boston, not just New York, but also from Tanzania, from Moldova, from Spain, from Kenya. Yeah? Open data also enables for better advocacy by individuals, by NGOs, and even policymakers. In Washington, D.C., we have this great organization called DC Action for Children. They're a think tank of sorts and an advocacy group. And they collect data and they work with a team of volunteer technologists and data scientists to create tools that are used to inform decisions by the education community. So city council calls on them, school agencies rely on their data to inform policy, and other NGOs who are actually serving schools on the ground use their data to make decisions or to think about the services that they're providing. We actually, a community group that I work with that advocates for education, and again, we're parents and teachers in the neighborhood. When in 2012, when DC Public Schools was looking at closing a bunch of schools because of low enrollment and for a bunch of other reasons, we wanted to see how closing these schools would impact neighborhoods in terms of walkability. So if you close a school, or the kids that attend that school, going to have to walk a whole lot more or travel a lot longer distance to get to the next school. So we called on DC Action for Children, and they created a map for us, and that showed there were which schools would be most impacted by this. Open data creates opportunities for educators to share content. Next. And even to help students learn skills while exploring topics that students themselves are personally interested in. New startup Tuba Labs translates open data sets from sources in, like the World Bank, like the Food and Drug Administration, local sports teams, and many more to create math problems that are in line with the United States Common Core standards. So they create these math problems from these open data sets. And then kids get to choose, based on whatever they're interested in, how to learn a skill or how to explore data based on their favorite sports team. There is even talk of a Minecraft API. So if you can imagine how many more data scientists we would just ramp up like that if we could get Minecraft in there. I don't know. This is for all the parents and geeks out there. And the next slide, please. And on a more institutional scale, open data can be really effective in inclusive policy design and implementation. An example here, in Washington, D.C., due to changes in demographics and population size and public school dynamics, Washington, D.C. is actually undergoing a large change in how students are assigned to their local schools. This impacts not only families of current students and prospective students, but also property owners. As we know, oftentimes our property value is impacted by the school that we would feed into and the quality of the school. Because the agency that is running this review was open to opening much of the data behind this effort, civic volunteer Chris Given, who is a member of Code for DC and a developer, was able to translate 50 pages of policy recommendations, right, into a 7-question survey that was mobile friendly. And which not only showed you the impact of each of these policy recommendations based on where you live, but it also enabled you to rate these impacts and then comment on them. To give you a sense of the impact of this, during the period the survey ran, which was about 2 weeks, the agency responsible for this effort collected about 400 surveys or through conversations and group discussions from 400 folks from face-to-face and online feedback collection. The application created by Chris Given collected 4,000 responses. So it just, the impact. And then on the next one, on policy implementation, this is ongoing and this is new, but the government of Moldova is going through an education reform process. And they are going to use open data to help inform and to help roll it out. What they're trying to engage families and they're trying to engage all kinds of education stakeholders. So open data will be leveraged to monitor education services and budget implementations in 100 Moldovan schools. And then it'll be shared via public meetings, community scorecards, and independent budget analysis. So if you're interested in this, I would definitely keep an eye on that effort. I guess moving on from education and maybe a little bit more into social impact, and I'll be much more quick in this. In my opinion, and kind of restating that, open data can help redefine development as long as the ingredients I mentioned earlier are present. We've all got access to the data, we know how to use it, and we work together. I love this tweet. I wrote a blog a few months ago about how entrepreneurs in the developing world are using open data even when there is no open data. So they're actually collecting it and creating it themselves. And I thought that was, they're collecting it and then they're making it open themselves and able to build services out of it. A really nice guy from Argentina tweeted it and said, "Nice article, too bad you said developing," because really these folks that are building these services and these apps are actually, they could be anywhere. So why are we distinguishing between developing and developed? So with that in mind, one thing that we're trying to do with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank is collect cases of uses of open data. So we've launched a survey, and we're doing some research and to kind of better understand and maybe also help inform a lot of the conversations that we have along this topic. So we launched a survey. We're going to make all of those results open, of course. We are having a series of Google Hangouts starting with this Friday to highlight some of the cases that we come across. And we certainly welcome your input. And there are links, and I think you'll share this.
Yes, all of the slides are available on our website.
Okay, so hopefully everyone here will participate. Sorry, the next one. So in terms of just 3 things, I didn't want to really talk about sectors in development. I just wanted to talk about, I don't know if I would call them trends or innovations that we're seeing. If you could go, Alex. That I mentioned this before, that kind of do-it-yourself smart city phenomenon that's happening, where in places where there isn't infrastructure, like for example Legos, transportation infrastructure isn't necessarily available. Whether it's that the government's not collecting it or can't collect it. So entrepreneurs are collecting the data. The example in Legos is Sub1, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, but they collect traffic data the way that Waze does. They crowdsource traffic data based on bus stops. So where folks may not be talking about this road or that road, New York Avenue or Massachusetts Avenue or whatever, they know where the bus stops are so that you can get a sense of where to travel based on this. Now, that sounds a lot like Waze. What's different about these guys is that they open up the API so that other folks can innovate around the data that they collect. Open data is also enabling the media to offer services. So some examples, so media not just as a way to inform people, but also to provide an actual service to the population. And I see that as a huge, huge social benefit. Some examples are a voter registration app that was developed by Code for Africa. It was implemented in Kenya and also in Malawi. In the Malawi example, it was also adopted by the government for its elections last year. And through this app, I think 30,000 voters, that's the number, 30,000 voters, 300,000 voters, 300,000, that's a lot bigger than 30, used this service via SMS to verify that they were registered. And about 46,000 people discovered that there were issues and that they hadn't registered. So they were able to resolve that before they got to the polling site. Yeah? And in Uruguay, by simply something similar to the example here from DC, is they have national health care insurance, but they have different options. And during the open enrollment period, this group Data, Uruguay, which is a group of media and technologists, community of media and technologists, built this application that let you put in a little bit of information about yourself and your family to be able to choose the best option for yourself. So again, this is another example of media providing this service. And then finally, just kind of go back and re-highlight the advocacy that can take place thanks to open data by communities. We're highlighting Follow the Money, which is in Nigeria, and they take aid data, they take local government data, they visualize it, and they work with local remote communities and to teach them how to report on how things are going in their implementations, project implementations. So they focus on education. They had a huge lead abatement project that they're still monitoring. And those are the folks we're going to talk to on Friday if you want to join us in the Hangout. And to conclude, I guess my biggest point is it's not really about the data. It's not really about open data. It's about whatever your problem is and how data can be used to support it. And it's also not really about where you are. So it's how you can use data to support it, and it's how we can work with government, we can work with other organizations to make it happen. And again, when I say we, I mean governments, institutions, communities, businesses, and individuals.
Great.
That's it.
Well, thank you. Let's now turn. Let's skip. I want to come back to you, Ryan, just so we can go through your slides, and then we'll
give you these all.
Thanks. Okay. Well, I'm sorry, Sandra, for proposing you go first, but I knew that you would have so many great examples. And what I'm interested in doing is thinking about categories of social impact, but also about how can we, as people who are interested in social, in social impact, think about advancing open data in this area. So I'm going to offer a couple of principles that I might want to use in thinking about how we can move forward as advocates to increase its impact in beyond economic development, which of course we all support as well. Oh, yes, no, yes. Okay, so a principle of thinking about why open data is so useful at this moment is thinking about where we're at technologically. So I wanted to begin by thinking about how do we frame open data for people. And of course, part of what we're doing is trying to resolve problems we've had for a long time, but we have new ways that we can solve them. And open data is a resource that we can use in this moment where we have new opportunities to solve them. Like Sandra was pointing out, it's not the developed world and the developing world anymore. It's lots of people in lots of places facing lots of different situations. And because of that connection that people can have through the internet and other means of deterritorialized connection, we can create solutions that were never possible before as a result of those connections. And so open data, the idea that information can be freely available anywhere to anyone, is really a source that enables exactly that kind of connection. And so I think that at this moment it's important to fuse thinking about where we're at technologically, globally, with an opportunity we have to enhance the connections that we already know can exist. Oh, here we go. Oh, sorry. There it is. Okay. All right, so the new analogy I wanted to kind of roll out today was thinking about how do we talk about open data with people who haven't yet kind of drunk the Kool-Aid, right? So we're talking about government officials who are interested in serving their communities, in advocates who are working on problems that are real, where they've been dug in for a long time and trying to find solutions. How do we sort of propose that open data is a way that we can begin to think about that? Particularly when budgets are tight, particularly when people have established networks and way of working on their issues. I wanted to begin by thinking about data as the 21st century's navigable waters. Now bear with me, I'm from Maine, I think about the ocean a lot. The concept of the public, we've talked about public data, I've written about public data, or open data in the past as a public good, which is the idea that this is a non-rival, non-excludable good. Everybody can use it. It doesn't get used up. And so, water is kind of another of those. The idea that you can access water freely is another of those. Yes. Okay. So, everybody dig back into your knowledge of public law. The public trust doctrine is the principle that all water must be accessible to everybody below the tide line. And this is actually, not an easy thing to achieve, right? I mean, that's valuable land. This is beachfront property. And this is land that the public is obliged to maintain. We don't really know what it's going to be used for when you make that kind of commitment to it. But as it turns out, it can be used for lots of things, right? It can be used for sailing your ship. It can be used for gathering clams. It can be used for collecting important research materials. It can be used to protect wildlife. We don't know necessarily when we make that commitment to the public to protect a good or to make a good available precisely what the benefits will be, but we do know that they're there, and we have faith that with the open access to it, people will make great use of it. So I wanted to kind of throw that out there as a framing you can use to encourage people to think about taking the leap of faith in commitment to the expense occasionally and the kind of new stakeholder development of creating an open data ecosystem. Okay. So if we are contemplating advocating for open data as a new public good along the lines of access to water, how do we make the best use of this public good? How do we ensure that people are using it to the extent that they can to have the kind of impact we know is possible? And we have lots of great examples. I'll share some more. What we want to know is how can we expand the use of those apps, expand the use of the sort of good data analysis so that we can solve the problems that we know that this kind of approach can solve. And I'm going to say, by talking a lot, by connecting with each other. I agree, it's not about the data, it's about other things, particularly the willingness to speak about aspects of it that allow us to communicate further and develop more. So my organization, the Sunlight Foundation, advocates for the development of open data policies, which is a governmental policy that promotes continual access to governmental data sets. And as part of what we've done, we've been telling the story of other places that have managed to successfully implement policies and develop useful services as a result. To kind of have a shareable document about this, we created recently a document called The Impacts of Open Data, which you can find on our website. And the purpose of this is to share stories of success, share examples that have demonstrated the value of open data in improving important social problems. And so I'm just going to run through the categories that we included in our document. But this is something that everybody who's interested in this area should think about doing. Come up with a couple of examples that you yourself really think are effective, and think about how you can communicate them out in your own sphere of work. All right. So my organization is focused very strongly on the need to create governmental transparency and accountability. So one of our categories is the way that open data enables the creation of greater governmental transparency. In this case, this example is the New York City Checkbook 2.0, which was developed by the New York City Comptroller's Office. And this is providing the very important public service of allowing New York City's residents to see how their tax dollars are being spent. The view that I pulled up is total spending. And they track it year over year. You can actually drill down to see details about exactly what they're spending on. They have information about individual contracts available. And all of this is very important for people who are interested in knowing what's being done in their name with their money, and want to be sure that their government is being run the way it publicly is presented to them. So I think it's a trust building as well as a civic engagement question. How do you display the workings of your government to your people? And so this is one way that New York City is doing it, through open data. Similarly, through greater transparency, you see the possibility of using open data to create better accountability for governmental officials. So using open data here in DC, WAMU developed a visualization of the relationship between governmental subsidies, developers, and campaign contributions. So this is a visualization of those relationships in their Deals for Developers story. Oh, darn it. Thank you. There, I'll leave it up there for a second so you can admire their work. It was a really important story, and what it did was it really helped to demonstrate the relationships that might have been suspected before, but without the data, nobody really can tell what is there. Okay. Another category that interests us is the improvement of governmental efficiency. So the idea that governments are using tax dollars well, and that people are satisfied with the way that the information the governments hold is being deployed in order to create good service. This is Data Science for Social Goods project to explore the relationship between light outages and crime in Chicago. This is the correlation between the length of time that lights are out and increases in crime. And they found a strong relationship between, in comparable districts, between light outages and increases in crime. Demonstrating that if you wanted to reduce spending on criminal justice and law enforcement, maybe you should get around to changing the light bulbs. All right. Governmental effectiveness is a related kind of improvement that you can achieve through open data. This is the Los Angeles Fire Department's response times around LA, demonstrating that certain areas of the city are not served as quickly as they should be. And revealing this through watching data patterns is, again, something that people might suspect, but it's the sort of thing that can only be demonstrated by a thorough study of exactly what the response times through tracking GPS are showing. Our final category in this document is the value of open data to increase public participation. And the example I pulled up here is an example from South Bend, Indiana. The City Voice app allows people to report uninhabited property or vacant property that needs city attention. In a lot of places where populations have declined, there's a real problem with blight, there's a problem with housing that's gone bad and has become dangerous to the community. And so increasing the ability of people to communicate with their officials and to hear back from officials about how they're planning to work with that property is a really important feature of City Voice's project. So I wanted to suggest that, again, sharing these good examples is one important thing that advocates can do. Another important thing that I want to increase kind of buy-in on is the idea that people should talk about the shared goals they have for open data. So sharing good examples is important, but sharing your sense of what the problems are specifically and what our goals should be is also very important. And we've had a couple of comments about the health data world, which is a really important and vital one for thinking about open data. And I think also does the best job that I've seen so far in terms of identifying shared goals. So I have been interested in thinking about how the identification of what they call the triple aim, which is increasing access to equitable and quality and cost at the same time, has really helped everybody work together despite being not directly coordinated, not formally coordinated. So speaking routinely about precisely what kinds of problems you're hoping to address through your open data intervention and what goals you have for improving does a lot to help the process of coordinating across this vast, potentially vast geographic space we could be cooperating across. Similarly, identify the data that you want for your objective. Open data broadly is very good, and my organization celebrates the opening of all data everywhere, but it's particularly important for advocates to recognize that some data will be most useful for their particular project and to focus on that early on. Perhaps you will need to collect it yourself, and you want to know that as soon as you can. So asking for specific data sets is a practice that I think we should all get into the habit of doing, and asking for those to be made available and open at the level where we need them helps both you and other people who share your objectives. Also, reaching out beyond governments to different community actors. I've highlighted here the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, which pushes the data they collected locally to the Baltimore City Open Data Portal as an example of the way that community groups can do their own collection, create their own open data, and help work with their local governments to broaden the reach of that data, benefiting both the organization and the city and its residents. So that's an increasing way that open data can be produced as well. Okay. A fourth thing that I think we should be getting into the habit of doing is communicating openly about data problems. And the commissioner touched on this to some extent. Thinking about data quality is incumbent, I think, upon all of us who work with open data, with data of any kind, to recognize that data quality is a fundamental requirement for doing public work with data. And so to think critically about how government data was collected, problems potentially with it, the potential for correcting problems is something that I think we should all be grappling with. Acknowledging the potential cost of transition to open data for governments that are not managing their data in a very clear or open-friendly way, and thinking about how we can help to do things help governments make that transition and support funding for transitions. I mean, thinking about supporting money going towards open data, I think, is something that we have to do the way that we have to think about protecting the environment. We have to focus on what we need to do in order to support this public good. The problem of protecting individual privacy, which we are constantly working on and is kind of an ever-moving target. Restricted public-private contracts, particularly when working with government data that might be held by a third party, I think is kind of also an area where we need some active conversation and thinking about how do we address these barriers where they exist, how do we talk with governments about making open, friendly contracts. And then finally, dealing with licensing and proprietary information. The question that the Commissioner also raised of how do you work with data that would be useful to have and yet contains proprietary information is a large problem, not just in the world of business. It can enter in mysterious ways. I just learned, for instance, that in one city a data schema, like a metadata schema, was itself proprietary information, and therefore that metadata could not be shared. And I thought, well, that's an impediment. And the last point I wanted to make was to suggest that you communicate with somebody new about open data. This is a relatively new term. The Google Trends chart that Sandra showed demonstrated the explosion, really, in interest in open data because this is a new conceptualization of access to government data and to sharing of non-government data as well, freely. So this is something where it needs everybody who's an advocate for it should be thinking about maybe talking about it with somebody new, and also bringing in new problems for open data to be connected with. Without new blood in the area, it becomes difficult to understand where it could best be applied. So what we really want to do is to connect problems to the potential we see in applying the open data concept to accessing data that will help people solve those problems. So encourage people that you find who may have problems that data could help with to ask for that data to be opened, to identify other people who may also need access to that data. If it doesn't exist, to collect it and share it freely, and to get in touch with people who publicly identify, like the Sunlight Foundation, as open data advocates, to think about who else might you connect with in order to regularize your access to the data that you need.
Great, thank you, Emily, and let's turn to Brian.
Hi, so I don't have any slides today, but I'd like to share some examples of you about healthcare open data. But the honest truth is there's a lot of room there, which is good because it's an opportunity, but I think it's important to look at the barriers between the use of our public health data and putting into practice or really determining what the questions are that we can ask that we couldn't ask before. So first I'm going to introduce you to SimCat, which is the company I work for. And what we've done is taken a large amount of CMS data and a lot of the medical data that is out there and start joining it together to allow consumers to find data that's related to the data they have. So if you have symptoms that you have, we're not going to tell you that you have a diagnosis because that's just an unrealistic goal at the moment. But what we can tell you is that a certain percentage of people with your symptoms have this disease and that you should investigate that further. We should also tell you that a medication you're taking may be contributing to those symptoms. Now, we're not going to tell you that it's contributing to those symptoms because that's, like I said, the role of a doctor. And that role will not change in the near future, no matter how much hype there may be that points to that. So a general user flow for SimCat initially was the symptom checker, where a patient would come and type in some symptoms, and then they would be asked for demographic and history information, very much like you would get on a doctor visit. Following that, they'd be, during the whole time that they were going through this process, they'd be given a differential, not diagnosis, it's a correlation between the public data, and then they would be allowed to select which one they thought was most likely, or they could select multiple, and then seek care options based on a set of criteria that they set forth. So looking at the open data that contributes to that chain, you have the linking of symptom and conditions, and you also have hospital data that is publicly available through the government. The medication data we use in a different part of the site. We allow for people to check interactions and side effects, and we hope to integrate that into a symptom checker as well, because clearly if someone presents with symptoms, they may have, it may be due to medications they're taking. So one thing we've realized is that to reach everyone, and we all have a health state at the moment, and mostly it's not a bunch of symptoms and a bunch of conditions, but it's a lot of things in your life that often aren't considered health, like what you do day to day. And that's what we're really starting to get into now, in looking at risk calculators that are medically verified, or academically verified. And I will warn you, if you go to the site, they're not there right now, but they should be shortly. And I think that's the shift in perspective that we'll see most of healthcare taking, where we want users to be generating the data and then incentivizing them to release things that are de-identified. But that helps eliminate a lot of the privacy questions if you have user consent. As long as there's transparency in how you're using that data that they're giving up. One of the best examples of open data in healthcare is genomics. The Open Genome Project would not be possible without open data models. There's no way that you collect that much disparate data that means very little on its, each piece of data means so little on its own, but as a whole you can start drawing correlations and use models to determine treatment and find correlations you would not have found otherwise. Also, open access journals are the other sort of large shift that is allowed for public access to information, but again, that's not really human, that's human readable, not necessarily machine readable. So there's, it's a good shift, it's in the right direction, there's room there. So I want to talk about the barriers we've had, because I think they're, from people we've talked to, it's sort of across the board, and that's the risk of making decisions with open data when it comes to people's health. We are humans and we empathize with humans, so the idea of making a poor decision for another person is a seriously negatively looked upon thing. So where we're seeing the room in the short term for gain is to work alongside with patients or consumers who can make decisions for themselves, and alongside eventually with doctors to allow them to see things that they may not have seen, but still to ultimately make the decisions themselves. And I think that's something that could be used across the board for open data. Right, so and sort of the perfect example of that done wrong is in the quants in economics, right? They made all these models, they trusted them without validating them, and it blew up in their faces. And that's certainly something that is not acceptable in healthcare for reasons other than in economics. So, the way that you allow people to interact with open data is through interfaces, and that's something that's left out of a lot of the open data conversations, is connecting people to that data in a way that makes sense to them, that takes advantage of the processes they're familiar with and doesn't add an extra burden for them to get to that data. So that's again sort of something we try to do at SimCat, where the experience is very much like going to your doctor. In fact, the two co-founders of my company are in residency, and they modeled the wizard interface off of that process, which is risky because then it starts to look like we're trying to be doctors, and we're not. We want to work alongside doctors. And what we really want to do is get you to the doctor that can give you the answer that you need. and not send you to the ER when you have a cold and things like that. When we talk about all this generation of new data, it's a lot of data streams, right? So we're talking about a lot of data coming at us from different places, and actually aggregating something meaningful is sort of the end goal. And I'd like to just draw the analogy that of a child when they first open their eyes and they have all these rods and cones that are receiving light, and they don't even perceive objects. And that sort of, you look at these data streams, each is one of those rods and cones, but then they have to develop processes that actually allow them to make better decisions than if they never had those rods and cones in the first place. And I think that's sort of where we are with health data, but I also think that there's a lot more data streams that will be opened up in the future with EMR, and as we navigate the ethical questions and privacy questions that are facing people. So in addition to learning how to process the data, allowing individuals to collect their own data has become very important. Things like Fitbit and aggregating that information as well. So those are a number of data streams you have about yourself. And companies like Human API are figuring out how to get your information free from these silos and allow you to make decisions across data streams that you have on yourself. But there isn't a commercial incentive for them to give you access to the raw data. So their Human API is interesting. I think they're sort of the furthest I've seen in terms of letting you aggregate data sources about yourself. But there is like I said, there is no incentive for them to give you access to that raw data, which is something I think as competition and the number of these companies increase, we'll see that as a feature that's offered, but it isn't now. And that same concept can be taken up to things like insurance companies. They certainly have a lot of data, and they use it for a lot of their financial decisions. And the more transparent that becomes, that's obviously beneficial to society. And down the line, it should be that that's actually a feature that they offer, that level of transparency.
Well, if you let me stop you there,
sure.
And then why don't we? I want to open it up to questions to the audience. I want to start with one question for the panel, and that gets to this issue that I think all of you touched on. That you can do so much with data when you get groups together, when there's problems to be solved. But of course, it requires a certain skill set. And how do we make sure the public has a skill set, the nonprofits have the skill set, and even government has the skill sets to actually take that next step and use the data, apply the data, but also really understand how to do it so it's effective, so that they're getting the feedback and we have these feedback loops. What are you seeing that's successful in this area?
Well, I want to point back to Sandra's exploration of open data and open lessons in education, because certainly this is a very important area that I've seen in collegiate and at secondary and collegiate level education. People are increasingly interested in visualization methods and in elementary, at least, statistical analysis. So, I mean, so much of what's valuable to see is pretty simple, is descriptive statistics, really, for the value of demonstrating impacts on particular areas, for instance, or on particular populations. And so, to some extent, I think that the big data work is not even kind of the bar that we need to get to for most issues. We're talking about relatively elementary information, I think, to pass along.
Well, I'll second that, and then just, I guess, maybe add kind of a more on the ground kind of manifestation of it. As we're seeing this open data energy kind of spread around cities and countries, states, the different communities that are coming together, and I think maybe the original communities are maybe like hackers groups, but where you have journalists coming together with technologists, and just these kind of informal, right, volunteer communities. The Code for America brigades, and then as we go out, there's Code for Africa and Code for Kenya, Code for Nepal just launched, and so bringing lots of folks who are well-meaning, who may have a great technical skill, but not quite sure about the content, and then folks maybe more like me who are, know what the problems are, but may not have a great technical abilities. And then also bringing in government. So there's well-meaning government folks that show up at these communities and bring back ideas, but also help loosen some of that data. I'm going to point to someone in DC, Nadella. He is DC's head GIS rock star, and I know there's a technical term for that, but I don't know. But I mean, folks like that advocating for this. With some of the work that I've done within the World Bank, we're trying to foster this. So on one end, working with governments to help them see the benefits of opening data, but on the other end, working with communities to be ready for it as well, and be ready to ask for it. Is that okay?
Yeah, and Brian, you're our hardcore data scientist on the panel.
I was going to say there's a large influx of technologies that didn't exist previously meant to fill this need, and a lot of machine learning. They're unvetted, but they're valuable. So I think it's important that we run them in parallel with the processes we have to validate them. Specifically in the case of triage, who do you blame when a machine triages someone poorly? That's a tough issue. But if you allow the current processes to unfold and maybe catch some errors that are happening in those processes, that's something that nobody would argue against. And I think it's a way of reducing risk, but adding value to the data that allows those decisions to be made. So I think there's technologies there that solve that problem, but they have to be validated.
Great. Well, I want to open it up. Start here.
So following on from that,
can you just introduce yourself?
Sorry, yes. I'm David Weber. I'm a geek open data. Emily, I happen to actually know quite a bit about that New York site that you pointed at. And I think it would be really useful, following on from Daniel's question, to add one or two more slides from there to show how you can drill down and then get a spreadsheet. And then you can do the kind of, if you can open it up in Excel, you can draw graphs but the other piece of that is you can actually see by department. So one of the ones I've looked at is the election department that runs the election. So what are they spending stuff on? $50,000 on taxi cabs, $20,000 on water coolers. Why? Why? Right? Well, most people that run elections are old, volunteers. So the two things they need is a ride to and from their house, and when they get there, they need some water. So you can begin to peel back the onion and see what's actually being spent. But the flip side of that is you can also see at the department level what people are being paid. And so New York took a lot of trouble to anonymize that, so you couldn't necessarily drill down and see, oh, that guy who's my neighbor who works gets paid X. Very interestingly, though, in California, they don't have that issue. If you work for the government at any level, your W-2 is public information. So it very much varies by jurisdiction, and that just shows one of the challenges of opening up data and ensuring that you're complying with all legal aspects as well.
Yes, it's an excellent point, and I wish I had put that on my problems to talk about, or problems with data access to talk about slide, is thinking about variation in public records laws across different areas. And there are different requirements for what can and cannot be put online in addition to what's public in the first place. And that's a great point that you have about the moving to the payroll data, because we've heard from a number of city officials who work with open data that is some of their most interesting data to viewers, and very often the views are coming from inside the government. So I mean, I think that that speaks to the universal interest of that topic. But like you're pointing out with the the value of being able to ask those questions about specific expenditures. It gives you such a multidimensional view of what that practice is, and it highlights the voluntary nature in some ways of participating in elections. I mean, I think that's a fascinating thing to look at. I'm glad you brought up that anecdote. That's neat.
It also works the other way around, is that citizens can recommend ideas back to government and say, hey, you can save money by doing this instead.
Exactly, yeah.
Let me push the panel a little further on this point, which you were alluding to, which is the fact that there is government. We've had a history of openness in government that depended on the fact that people didn't have actually access to the data very easily, and so there is this new tension. We've seen this crop up many times, with gun permits, with sex offenders, with mugshots, where the whole point was we wanted this information to be in the public, but now that it's really in the public, people don't like that. How does the open data movement reconcile, the push for openness with, some, questioning about should these records still be public? Do you revisit that, or do you still rely on the inaccessibility to prevent you from using this open data, but still providing some kind of restrictions?
Anybody want that?
I don't know that I do.
Oh, well, yeah, no, we face this quite a bit because, of course, we're advocating for public records to be put online, and many of them, were in that state of latently public. And I think it's a really interesting and important question. We, want to point out that the more data that's available, the more we can make good decisions about government use of money, of policy outcomes. But of course, it interacts with this question of individual privacy. And whereas we think that it's important to know what decision makers, transparency to the point of knowledge about individuals helps us learn about people in power and what they're doing with the privileges of that power, and we think that's very important. We also recognize that people without power, do not need to be doubly disempowered by excessive, access to their records. So, for instance, do we need to have all of the information about individual receivers of food stamps or WIC benefits, made public online, even though to some degree some aspects of that are public? So, I think this is a really important area for people that work on open data to work on. And we're currently looking at questions around anonymization and de-identification in connection with open data.
Yeah, right there. Yes.
So Sandra and I both are from data providers, but I actually have a question for sort of intermediaries, Emily and Brian. Governments, so I'm both in Powell from Census Bureau, governments are, I guess, statistically bad at marketing. If you look at government or credibility of governments, like sort of at an all-time low or whatever, so it just gives you that's some evidence. But one thing that you guys are doing, and a number of other people are doing as well, is facilitating a relationship between data users and data providers, sort of a data advocacy intermediary, I'd say. How and what would help government, I think, be better at providing data for data users? Typically, what I mean in a social sense, social impact sense, those people are in a situation sometimes, I would assume, many times, in an unknown data territory. Like, I don't even know what kind of data I should be asking for that would help me in making this decision. It seems that there's a great deal of opportunity for people like Sunlight, as well as other entrepreneurial as non-governmental organizations, to come in there and fill that void of that knowledge gap, and help connect the people who have the data to the people who might need it, but they just don't know it yet. So in those two senses, in these two, one on a commercial sense and one in a not-for-profit and social sense, what is the impetus? What was the impetus? The story behind what you briefly touched on it, Brian. The story that started your organization, and how would governments spur more of those types of organizations flourishing? And how would we increase the amount of, and how are you guys doing in advocating for data users? Are you proving that the things that you're creating are useful in this sense, for social good? I'm sorry, that was a pretty long-winded question. So
that's okay. That's great. I think there's situations where data can take the expertise of people that exist and sort of supplement that. And then there's places where data can allow us to ask new questions. And the new questions are hard to figure out what they even are, not just to get to the answers. So I think focusing on those places where there are processes that could be made more efficient by having increased access to data is probably the most easily targeted area to draw that connection between the data and the impact. So that's how I would split apart that problem and try to find more focus.
So the Sunlight Foundation has a document called the Open Data Policy Guidelines, which we use when we're talking about open data with governments, with local and state governments primarily, with governments around the world actually. And one of the points that we advocate for is that all governments considering or beginning to open their data create an inventory of all of their holdings. And this, I think, is a primary and fundamental step to letting people know what's there. So to some extent, you have to kind of embrace the idea that we don't know what people are going to be interested in and accept that, and that navigable waters kind of, okay, we're going to make the beach happen way, but they don't know what's not there, or then they don't know what is there unless that's made very public. And I think the census does a better job than many governmental agencies at doing that. And these things could be highlighted more and be made even more thorough. So something that we think is very important and can be a challenge because frequently governments and government agencies and departments themselves may not know what they have. So the process of conducting those inventories, we think, is critical to letting people know what's out there. And institutions, new sites like data.gov and other kinds of aggregators can help highlight that for people who are interested in seeking out data for the purposes of using it for new applications. Organizations that are embracing the use of data to help spur community change. I saw Kathy Pettit here somewhere from the Urban Institute and their National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership does a lot of work collecting data and connecting local organizations with data that might be helpful in completing their work. So there are organizations that are actively helping to connect non-data using organizations with data.
What was that here?
Kathy, are you here? Oh, go see that one.
Okay.
We're going to do a lightning round, 2 more questions. So right here and right back there.
So my name is Elizabeth Prescott, and I'm with the State Department, and appreciate the comments and the focus on how we can use data in better governance. The question I have is as someone who's working to try and make data available and struggling to find it within the organization, but also the fear of the presumption that governments always are right and know what they're doing, and when you put data out there, it's risky. But yet there's sort of a changing contract where there has to be some awareness that in forgiveness of governments making decisions that may not be perfect as long as they work towards a better solution. I'm wondering if you're seeing that transition where it's not a Washington Post headline every time there's lots of money spent on water or something like that, but actually a conversation that is less punitive towards government and more working towards a collaborative solution. And I think it's getting over the fear of what the headline says about things would much more rapidly release data into public space.
Let's get the second question, then we'll respond. Yes.
Yes. Hi. My name's Anna. I'm with Shoka. So my question is touching on the challenges that you mentioned, Emily, regarding the trade-offs and monetizing and the value to the public of opening data. What would you recommend to organizations that might be low resource, like a Shoka nonprofit, but that actually has a wealth of information that could be operationalized and built upon to open up to the public when, on a daily basis, people are incentivized just by getting basic funding for their initial projects? How do you incentivize them to view the less traditional open data value of building up this information?
I'll give the punitive question a shot, and I'm going to listen closely to the answer to your question. I think we're all struggling with resources. So I'm not sure that there is a good answer, because there are lots of folks all over the place that are that kind of make a living from those kinds of responses. But I think part of the case that has been made all along about open data to make folks in government feel a little less afraid is that it will help you improve things. And among those things is quality. And so if you are wrong about something and it's out there for all the world to see, as long as there's a response, an honest response, and then a correction, it seems to make things better. Or it seems to make those conversations go a little bit better. I don't necessarily have really good examples, and you might have better ones. Have good ones, Emily.
Oh, I was thinking about how some of it, like just like Sandra's saying, is kind of in the attitude towards it, and I'm thinking about groups like New York's Transparency Working Group, which brings public officials and public advocates, open government advocates, League of Women Voters, Common Cause together to talk about how the open data work is going. And having that kind of we're all in it together, we're all trying to improve this for all of us attitude, I think is very helpful, and having those oops moments kind of pass through.
And then to respond to the second part.
Yes, and I was hoping that Sandra would have a point about this, because I'm wondering if, so something that I think is very inspiring from the perspective of allowing community groups that are so close to the data collection or can conduct that data collection, help them share it out, is the work that we're seeing where community groups are working with governments or with larger organizations or in partnership with other organizations to create community portals where the costs can be shared, or ideally if a government can bear the costs, is capable of it, at hosting that data and kind of maintaining it there, that's also ideal, because then it can be easily integrated with other relevant data. So we have Philadelphia had a community portal going that was an opportunity to do that kind of work. Again, I think Baltimore is one of the closer examples of a city and an organization working closer together. And I'm thinking that Ashoka is based, you work internationally, and in what countries? All of them. I mean, I wonder if, I don't know enough about the IATI's holdings, but, I wonder if there might be some kind of related platform there, or, maybe the whole thing.
Actually, I do have a thought. I don't want to name names, but if you look at some of the, or many of the open data platforms that are out there, reaching out to them directly and making a case, I do feel like, and we can talk afterwards, but I do feel like there is openness to kind of support openness, not just the for-profit, but for the community. I'm not going to put any put anyone not in a weird spot, but I'll give you suggestions.
I think there's also an opportunity to use the data that you have to draw attention to your organization, and that is really the way that we've approached it. Now, I think we actually have not released any user-generated data because we have to address those privacy concerns and everything else, and that's a process and takes time and energy. But I think ultimately we will be doing that because it's a valuable way to draw attention to our organization.
Great. Well, I appreciate everyone spending the time here. This is obviously a conversation that we're going to continue to have. If you're interested in this topic, we're going to have an event next week at ITIF on disruptive innovation and big data, so I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. And thank you again for coming. Please join me in thanking our panelists.